Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. The news didn't sound like news at first. It came buried between a segment about rising fuel prices and a weather report predicting another dry week, the kind of filler you hear when a station has nothing important to talk about. The announcer's voice was calm, almost bored, as he mentioned isolated disturbances in a few neighboring counties. There was no urgency in his tone, but something about the phrasing made me stop what I was doing. I was in the backyard at the time, crouched by the gate with oil-stained gloves on, trying to fix a sagging hinge. The late afternoon air had a bite to it, and a gust of wind rustled the dry leaves across the grass. I straightened slowly, wiping my hands on my jeans, and listened as the radio carried on through the open kitchen window. "Authorities are monitoring the situation," the announcer said, "and ask that residents remain calm and avoid speculation." That was all I needed to hear. I'd heard this language before. The carefully vague wording they used when something bigger was happening than they wanted to admit. I knew what it meant. It meant something was wrong, and if I waited for the full story, I'd be too late. I went inside, shut off the radio, and headed straight for the kitchen sink. Some people would have sat there waiting for more details, but I'd learned not to trust that the taps would keep running forever. It only takes one power grid hiccup or a contamination warning, and suddenly everyone is fighting for bottled water at the store. Or worse, drinking out of whatever puddle they can find. I'd seen it before when storms knocked out utilities. People panic fast, and the shelves empty faster, so I didn't wait. I filled every container I could find. Glass jars, milk jugs I hadn't gotten around to recycling, 5-gallon buckets, even the old camping cooler I'd shoved in the garage. I filled them until they sloshed. By the time the sink was running low on pressure, the countertops and floor were crowded with sealed lids and dripping caps. When that was done, I unlocked the gun safe. Rifles, pistols, carbines. All of it came out and onto the dining table. I started feeding rounds into magazines in a steady rhythm, hands moving on muscle memory after years at the range. I loaded each shotgun and placed them strategically around the house. One behind the bedroom door, one in the hallway closet, another in the kitchen. Normally I kept everything locked up tight, but those safes would only slow me down now. This wasn't panic, this was habit. My name is Ethan Cole, and I already knew this wasn't going to be the kind of emergency you walk away from in a day or two. I had been preparing for years, not because I thought something like this was inevitable, but because life had shown me how quickly everything could be taken away. My father had died on a construction site when I was still a teenager, crushed under a load of scaffolding because some company decided safety inspections were too expensive. The lawsuit dragged on for years, but in the end, no one was held accountable. My mother drowned herself in alcohol to cope, and I had watched her disappear one bottle at a time. When my grandmother's cancer returned, I took care of her myself, making sure she got to every appointment, following the doctor's instructions to the letter. Then one day the dosage was wrong, some pharmacist's error or a rushed order from the hospital, and she was gone within weeks. Those experiences had carved a simple truth into me. No one was coming to save me. The government, the courts, the health system, they all failed when it mattered most. I decided long ago that I would never put my life in someone else's hands again. By the time night fell, the house looked like a fortress. Machetes and katanas leaned against the walls, and I had guns staged in every room. I sat at the kitchen table with a lantern burning low, listening to the distant hum of helicopters. The local news was still telling people to remain calm and stay home. That was easy for them to say from behind a studio desk. I slept in the living room that night, rifle within reach. The following morning, the distant sounds of sirens pulled me out of a restless sleep. I climbed the ladder to the attic and peered through the dusty window overlooking Main Street. Military trucks were lined up along the road, soldiers barking orders as they escorted groups of residents toward buses idling at the school. Loudspeakers ordered everyone to evacuate immediately. I watched from the shadows as my neighbors filed out of their houses with bags slung over their shoulders, kids clinging to their parents. I didn't move. I knew what happened in those so-called safe zones. Families packed into gymnasiums like cattle, supplies running thin within days, one sick person infecting everyone else. The thought of being trapped in one of those camps was worse than staying here alone. I climbed back down and spent the rest of the morning reinforcing my doors and windows with extra braces and whatever lumber I had left in the shed. Every board I nailed in place bought me more time if someone, or something, tried to get inside. By afternoon, the street outside was empty, not even the sound of a car engine in the distance. The silence was unsettling. The town had never been this still. I heated a can of soup on the camping stove, sat at the counter, and dialed my brother's number. Ryan answered on the third ring, his voice shaky, and told me to come to the city. The National Guard had set up quarantine zones there, and he insisted it was safer than staying here. I told him no. I had food, water, weapons, and defenses. I wasn't about to abandon all of that for a tent city surrounded by fences. I told him that if things got bad, he and his wife and their boy should come here instead. He didn't like that answer, but I ended the call before we could argue. That night the gunfire started. At first it was distant, just faint cracks carried by the wind from somewhere beyond the hills, but the bursts kept coming. Screams followed, carried for a few seconds before fading back into silence. I shut off every light and sat on the floor in the corner of the living room with my rifle across my knees, waiting for any sign the noise was moving closer. At some point I heard a shuffle in the yard. I eased the back door open, staying low, and crept toward the shed. The motion sensor light above the garage flicked on, throwing a harsh beam over the grass. It was only a dog. The animal was rail-thin, fur-matted, ribs showing through its coat. It froze in the light for a second, then bolted toward the trees. I let the door close and went back inside, though I left the rifle in my hands until I finally drifted into a light sleep. The third morning, I decided to move. Supplies weren't going to replenish themselves, and I needed to see how bad things really were. I strapped on a chest rig and slung my rifle over my shoulder before stepping onto the empty street. Main Street was a graveyard. Cars sat abandoned at odd angles, some with doors left open, as if the drivers had been forced to leave in a hurry. I could see where barricades had been torn down near the school and where soldiers had tried to organize people. I moved quickly, keeping to alleys and side streets until I reached the hardware store. The front windows were shattered, but inside I managed to find nails, screws, and a roll of chain link fence still intact. I stuffed them into my pack, grabbed a pair of bolt cutters from the wall, and moved on. The pharmacy was worse. Most of the shelves were picked clean, but I found a few bottles of painkillers and antibiotics hidden behind a display rack. I didn't linger. Being caught off guard in an open building was a good way to die. When I stepped back into the street, I froze. A man was staggering toward me from the far end of the block. His clothes were shredded, skin pale and blotched with dark veins. He collapsed onto the pavement. Then he got back up. I ducked into an alley, my rifle raised, as the man turned in my direction. There was nothing human left in his eyes, just a milky film that made him look blind. He lurched forward with a burst of speed that didn't make sense given his condition. I fired once. The sound exploded off the walls, and the man crumpled onto the pavement. I didn't wait to see if he stayed down. I sprinted back toward the edge of town, keeping my head low, weaving through side streets until I reached the safety of the house. I shut the door, locked it, and dragged another dresser in front of it before allowing myself to breathe. The rest of the day was spent fortifying. I doubled the tripwires around the perimeter and hung tin cans on fishing line, so I'd have a warning if something came too close. I inventoried my supplies and rearranged the food storage in the bunker so I could access what I needed faster. By the time I finally sat down, the house felt more like a fortress than ever, but that didn't bring much comfort. The knocking from the night before kept creeping into my thoughts. Whoever it was hadn't come back, but I didn't think for a second that they had just given up and left town. There were still people out there, wandering like me, scared and desperate. That made them unpredictable. The radio crackled later that evening, cutting through the silence with a sharp burst of static before a voice came through, low and urgent. "Attention residents of Greene County and surrounding areas," the announcer said. Mandatory curfew is in effect from sunset to sunrise. Please comply with evacuation orders. Designated safe zones are operating at full capacity and will continue to process arrivals for as long as possible. The voice repeated the message twice before fading out. I shut the radio off. I knew what those safe zones meant. Bus rides to packed school gyms, cots lined up in rows, armed guards controlling who could leave and who couldn't. And once supplies got low, people would start turning on each other. I'd read enough case studies to know how fast that would spiral. I went room by room checking locks, bolting shutters, making sure my weapons were loaded and placed where I could reach them in seconds. The idea was simple. If anyone broke through, I wouldn't need to waste time running to a gun safe. Later, as darkness settled in, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with my brother's name. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but I swiped to answer. Ryan didn't waste time on small talk. He told me he had just seen footage from the city streets, crowds of people rushing barricades as soldiers tried to keep order. He said the National Guard was building walls around the quarantine centers, and anyone outside after curfew was being arrested or shot. He begged me to come into the city, to be with him and his family where there was real protection. I told him I wasn't leaving. Not now. The silence on the line was heavy. He accused me of being stubborn, of overreacting, but I told him the truth. The moment I stepped into one of those zones, I'd be at the mercy of the same people who had failed us time and time again. There was no guarantee I'd even make it inside before the walls closed. I told him what I had said before. If things got bad, he should come to me. He didn't want to hear it, but I ended the call before it turned into an argument. That night, the sounds from outside shifted. It wasn't gunfire anymore. Not just. There were distant blasts, heavy enough to rattle the windows, followed by columns of smoke rising in the distance. I lay awake on the couch with a rifle across my lap, listening to the faint echoes. At one point I thought I heard voices close to the house, but when I crept to the window and peered out, there was only the wind brushing the trees. Sleep didn't come easy. Morning brought another announcement over the emergency broadcast channel. Evacuation centers were reaching maximum capacity. Any remaining residents were to report to the county school by 3 p.m. for transport. The announcer's tone was strained now, clipped in a way that made me think even he didn't believe the words he was saying. I shut off the radio and went back to work. The next 12 hours were a blur of quiet preparation. I reinforced the doors with additional braces, layering thick planks across each entrance and anchoring them to the studs. In the backyard, I scavenged old fence posts and nailed them into the ground at sharp angles to create a crude barrier. I laced more fishing line across choke points leading to the house and hung metal cans filled with pebbles that would rattle if disturbed. My goal wasn't to make the property impenetrable. That was impossible. What I needed was time. Any warning that someone or something was coming so I could be ready. In the evening, I went into the bunker to reorganize. The small dugout cellar was cramped, but every square foot mattered. I shifted the heavier crates of ammo toward the back, stacked canned food by expiration date, and checked the water barrels for leaks. I pulled out a few boxes of freeze-dried meals and laid them near the entrance, easy to grab in a hurry. I sat on the cot for a few minutes and listened. The bunker was underground and insulated, but I thought I could still hear faint hums from engines far away, like the city was vibrating under the strain of everything happening at once. When I came back into the house, the sun was dropping below the tree line. I closed the blackout curtains and flicked off the single lamp I had been using. Outside, the silence was thicker than the night before. I ate a quick meal and took my place near the front door, the rifle propped against my shoulder as I stared at the barricaded entryway. My mind kept circling back to the knock from a few nights ago. If it had been someone desperate for help, would they return? Or would someone worse find me first? The fifth day started with the distant sound of helicopters. I climbed up to the attic window and spotted two of them flying low over the town, heavy with equipment slung beneath. They didn't circle, didn't slow down, just passed by and disappeared beyond the hills. I went back down and made another call to Ryan. This time there was no answer. The rest of the day was more of the same, checking the perimeter, fine-tuning the defenses, making sure nothing had shifted or failed overnight. I kept busy because if I stopped moving, my thoughts went to places I didn't want them to go. Every sound outside made me tense. Once, I caught sight of someone creeping through a yard 2 houses down, hunched low and moving fast, but they didn't approach. I stayed silent and watched until they disappeared around the corner. By the time darkness came, I was wound tight from the waiting. I cooked nothing, not wanting the smell of food to drift out into the night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a cold meal from a can, the lantern turned low. Just after midnight, the tripwire cans on the north side of the property rattled. I didn't move at first. I stayed low, straining to separate the faint metallic clatter from the wind brushing through the trees. The sound came again, a sharper scrape this time, as if someone had nudged the line and set the cans clinking together. I gripped the rifle tighter and eased forward, careful not to make a sound as I approached the window overlooking that side of the yard. Outside, the moonlight was pale and broken by drifting clouds. The perimeter fence cast uneven shadows across the grass. I saw nothing at first. No movement. No figures creeping near the traps. But the line had definitely been disturbed. Something had been close enough to touch it. I waited several minutes before sliding the window open just enough to poke the barrel of the rifle through. My breath felt too loud in the silence, so I held it as I scanned the yard. Still nothing. A dog barked in the distance, a low and short sound that cut off quickly. Then came the faintest shuffle, the dry crackle of leaves being stepped on somewhere beyond the fence line. I followed the sound, the crosshairs tracing the tree line, but the figure never emerged. Eventually the noises faded, leaving only the hum of insects and the whisper of wind. I stayed awake for hours after that, checking the perimeter twice before the sky lightened. Whatever had set off the cans hadn't tried again, but I didn't fool myself into thinking I was alone out here. The next morning brought the unmistakable thrum of helicopter rotors. I climbed the attic ladder and peered through the dusty window to see 2 National Guard helicopters circling over the town. Below them, military trucks were parked at intersections. Soldiers waving people toward collection points. Loudspeakers blared instructions to report to the buses lined up outside the school. I stayed in the shadows, watching the scene unfold. Families hurried down the streets carrying bags, children holding onto their parents' arms. Some looked relieved, others terrified. Soldiers moved among them, keeping the lines orderly. The buses left in waves, each one heavier than the last. One neighbor across the street, an older man I vaguely knew from passing conversations, stood on his porch for a long time as the soldiers called out to him. Finally, he stepped down and joined the others, clutching a small suitcase. By afternoon, the street was empty again. The buses had taken everyone who was willing to go. I stepped back from the window and sat against the attic wall for several minutes, listening to the faint echo of the departing engines. Part of me wondered if I had made a mistake, if those people were walking into safety while I stayed behind in a dying town, waiting for whatever came next. But the memory of my grandmother in that hospital bed came back sharp. No one had saved her. No one had saved my father when the scaffolding collapsed, and no one was going to save me. By the time evening came, I was already planning my next move. Supplies wouldn't last forever, and with the town now emptied, I had a window of opportunity to resupply before looters or infected stripped it bare. I gathered my gear, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and stepped into the street as darkness fell. The quiet was suffocating. No voices, no cars, no signs of life. I kept to the alleys, checking corners before moving, ears tuned for any sound out of place. My first stop was the gas station on Main. The front door was locked, but the side window had been smashed. I climbed through carefully and landed behind the counter. The shelves had been picked over, but I managed to find a few bottles of engine oil, lighter fluid, and a half-full box of snack bars. In the back office, I pried open the register drawers and found a few crumpled bills. They were useless now, but I kept them anyway. Next was the hardware store. I bypassed the front entrance entirely and used the bolt cutters to slip through the locked loading dock. Inside, I scavenged screws, nails, rolls of wire, a few spare padlocks, and a couple lengths of sturdy chain. Each item went into my pack with care. I was only taking what I could carry and what I knew I would need. The pharmacy was the riskiest stop. The front windows had been shattered, and there was glass scattered across the sidewalk. I crouched low and scanned the interior. The aisles were dark, lit only by the pale light from the street, but I didn't see movement. I slipped inside and moved quickly. Most of the shelves were bare, but I found a few bottles of antiseptic and a small stash of antibiotics hidden behind a display of cosmetics. I stuffed them into my bag, then froze when a sound drifted from the far aisle. It was soft, almost like fabric brushing against metal. Then came a low groan. I ducked behind the counter, rifle ready, as the groan grew louder. A figure stumbled into view at the end of the aisle. Its head lolled at an unnatural angle, and the way it moved was wrong, jerky, uncoordinated, but fast enough to close the distance if it heard me. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The creature turned toward a distant clatter somewhere deeper in the building and lurched away. I waited until the sound of its shuffling footsteps faded, then slipped out through the broken window as quietly as I could. I made it back to the house without incident, but I couldn't shake the image of that thing moving through the pharmacy. It hadn't been blind. When the glass crunched under my boot, its head had snapped toward me instantly. Sound mattered. That was something I could use. The 8th day began with more looting trips, this time focusing on places I hadn't dared enter when the town was full. An auto parts store yielded a few tools and a jug of fuel stabilizer. An abandoned hunting shop gave me extra ammunition and a set of heavy-duty gloves. I avoided the grocery stores entirely. They were too obvious, too likely to draw others looking for food. Every trip into town carried a higher risk. I saw the infected more often now, wandering in ones and twos. They didn't move in straight lines, and sometimes they would stop for long stretches as if listening. I learned to watch for those pauses, to stay hidden until they moved on. Once, while slipping through the alley behind a row of stores, I saw one of them crouched over something on the ground. Its shoulders hunched as it tore into the corpse of a dog, the wet tearing sound carrying in the silence. I backed away slowly, my finger tight on the trigger, but it never looked up. I returned home with a full pack and a better understanding of what I was dealing with. Noise attracted them, and they didn't seem to lose interest quickly once they heard something. That knowledge shaped how I arranged the traps around the property that night. I created more distractions, things that would draw them to the far side of the yard if they came close. By the 9th day, the town was a shell of itself. Grass was already beginning to creep through the cracks in the pavement, and wind carried scraps of paper and trash down the empty streets. I spent the morning observing from the attic window. The infected were becoming more common. I saw 3 of them move in a loose group down Main Street, pausing frequently, sniffing the air. I decided it was time to stop going into town, unless absolutely necessary. I had enough supplies for now, and the risk was growing too high. That night, I shut off the lights early and sat near the front door in the dark, listening to the faint sounds drifting through the neighborhood. Somewhere close, an infected groaned, followed by the distant rattle of one of my tripwires. I didn't move for nearly an hour. My eyes locked on the boarded windows as I waited for something to happen. Whatever had triggered the line moved off eventually, but the faint sound of its dragging feet stayed in my head even after silence returned. I realized that the days of waiting passively for things to get better were gone. It was time to build defenses that could actually buy me time if something breached the perimeter. The next morning, I started working as soon as the sky brightened. I scouted the yard slowly, looking for places to funnel anyone or anything into open areas where I would have the advantage. I drew crude maps in a notebook, marking sightlines from the upstairs windows and measuring distances I could cover with a rifle. I used what I had on hand to create heavier tripwires, replacing the fishing line with steel wire that would be harder to spot. I attached old tools, metal scrap, and empty propane canisters to the lines so that anything bumping into them would make enough noise to wake the dead. In a way, that's exactly what I wanted. Sound would bring the infected into the open, where I could take shots from cover. Barricades came next. I drove salvaged fence posts deep into the ground at angles, weaving rusted chain-link fencing between them to create jagged obstacles. I used scrap wood and leftover plywood from the shed to shore up the weakest points in the fence, hammering until my arms ached. By mid-afternoon, I had turned the yard into a choke point. If something pushed through the outer perimeter, it would be forced into narrow paths that I could cover with overlapping fields of fire from the upstairs windows. I didn't kid myself. These measures wouldn't stop a determined group of survivors with tools or heavy weapons, but they might slow them down long enough for me to react. And against the infected, who didn't seem capable of reasoning through obstacles, the barriers might hold for a while. That evening I made my rounds again, double-checking the traps and resetting any lines that looked off. The silence of the neighborhood had started to feel heavier. The distant gunfire that had punctuated the nights in the first week was gone now. No more helicopters, no more sirens, just wind through the trees and the occasional unnerving groan carried on it. The 11th day started quietly. I had just finished replacing the batteries in one of the motion sensors when I heard it. The muffled sound of footsteps crunching in the gravel driveway. Not the shuffling scrape I had come to associate with the infected, but steady human footsteps. I crouched behind the fence and waited, rifle raised. The steps stopped, and then a voice cut through the silence. "Hello?" It was hoarse, cracking on the edges. Please, is anyone there?" I stayed hidden, my finger brushing the trigger guard. "Please," the voice said again, closer now. "I don't have anywhere else to go. I'm not sick. I just need food. Just for tonight." I could make out the figure now, a thin man in his late 20s or early 30s. His clothes were torn, and he clutched something in his hand, but I couldn't see what it was. He looked around the yard, eyes darting like he expected something to jump out at him. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay silent. If I let him in, he could be dangerous. He could be infected. He could bring others back with him later. And yet, as he stood there, hunched over like the weight of the world was on his shoulders, I couldn't help but think of all the people who had begged for help in the last few weeks, and never gotten it. I forced myself to act. I aimed at the ground a few feet from his boots and fired a single warning shot. The crack echoed through the street. The man jumped back, dropping whatever he was holding. He looked toward the fence, saw nothing, and then ran. His figure disappeared into the trees within seconds. I waited another full minute before lowering the rifle. My hands trembled as I picked up the shell casing and slipped it into my pocket. The rest of the day I couldn't stop thinking about him. He had been thin, desperate, and very likely unarmed. Maybe he would starve because of me. Maybe he would find someone else and get the help I had refused him. Or maybe he would be dead by morning. I hated that I would never know which. That night I watched the perimeter twice as carefully. I expected the man to return, maybe with friends, but no one came. The silence returned, heavier than ever. I realized that pushing him away had reinforced something I had already known deep down. I couldn't trust anyone out there. The 12th day brought new problems. I woke to the sound of something moving slowly near the outer fence. When I looked out the window, I saw my first clear view of an infected up close. It was standing in the yard across the street, head tilted, as if listening. Its skin looked pale and stretched thin over its frame, patches of hair falling away. Every few seconds it twitched, shifting its weight from one foot to the other, but it didn't wander off. I stayed perfectly still behind the curtain, hardly daring to breathe. Minutes passed. Then it let out a low groan and turned in a slow circle, like it was searching for something it couldn't quite sense. When one of the tin can traps rattled faintly in the breeze, the infected's head snapped in that direction with startling speed. It shuffled forward a few steps and then stopped again, waiting. I watched for nearly an hour before it finally moved on, vanishing down the road. The sight of it lingered with me all day. The infected weren't like animals that would lose interest after a few minutes. Once something drew them in, they stayed. That meant if one of them reached my property, it might stay outside for hours, maybe days, until something pulled it away. That knowledge changed how I approached everything. I spent the afternoon making my traps more subtle, moving them away from the main house so the noise wouldn't draw the infected straight to me. I layered distractions into the outer yard, things that would create noise far from where I slept. By the time night came, I felt more secure, but I also knew the margin for error was shrinking. The infected were coming closer now. They were learning the shape of the town, exploring the empty spaces people had left behind. It was only a matter of time before one stumbled onto my defenses and tested them for real. When morning broke on the 13th day, I had already decided that the only way forward was to impose a routine on myself. Waiting without purpose was dangerous. It led to mistakes and made fear grow louder in my head. So I forced myself to get up at dawn, eat a simple meal, and start by walking the perimeter. Each trapline, each barricade, and each stretch of fence was checked carefully. I documented everything in a small notebook, where the lines had shifted in the wind, where footprints appeared in the soft earth, what needed repair. After that came the trips into town. I didn't stay long, and I didn't go anywhere obvious like the grocery store or the big box chains. Instead, I focused on overlooked places, storage sheds behind closed shops, gas stations on the outskirts, empty houses where neighbors had evacuated. I moved slowly, watching corners and windows, slipping through alleys instead of open streets. One of those trips yielded a lucky find. Behind an old auto repair shop, I discovered a spool of heavy-duty cable still wrapped in plastic. It was exactly what I needed for stronger trap lines, and I hauled it back carefully, using side streets and cutting across yards to avoid being exposed. I also came across a few working flashlights and an unopened case of batteries. That night I stored them in the bunker and updated my supply list with a grim satisfaction. The bunker had become my anchor in those days. Every evening, once the sun dipped and I knew it was too dangerous to be outside, I would retreat into that cramped space and sit on the cot with the lantern burning low. I used the time to read. I went through old survival manuals and guides I'd collected over the years, looking for anything I might have missed or forgotten. It kept my mind busy and reminded me why I had spent years preparing for something I had hoped would never happen. The 14th day brought me closer to the infected than I had been since this all started. I had been experimenting with the new cable, setting snares around the far edge of the yard in hopes of catching stray animals I could use for bait or food. Early that afternoon, I heard the trapline snap and the cans rattle violently. I took my rifle and approached slowly, keeping low. What I found made me pause. One of the infected was tangled in the cable, thrashing violently as it tried to pull free. It wasn't fresh. The skin on its arms and face was dry and peeling, and its clothes were caked with dirt and blood. But it had strength. It jerked and twisted, the steel biting into its limbs, yet it didn't seem to feel the pain at all. I crouched behind a tree and watched for a long time. It never stopped moving. When the trapline shifted and the cable cut deeper, it didn't even slow down. It didn't scream or cry out the way a living person would have. It just kept straining toward me, mouth open, teeth snapping in the air. I studied it for hours, carefully changing position to stay out of its reach. The sun dipped lower, but it didn't tire. Even after thrashing for hours, it was just as determined as when I had first arrived. That observation cemented what I already suspected. Once the infected locked onto a target, they didn't lose interest. When it was finally too dark to see clearly, I put a single round into its head and cut the cable free. I buried the body in a shallow grave near the edge of the property, marking the spot with a stone so I'd remember where it was. The image of its ceaseless struggling followed me back to the house. That night I wrote down everything I had learned. They didn't tire, they didn't feel pain, and they didn't wander away unless something distracted them. That knowledge would shape every decision I made from then on. The 15th day was when I began thinking less about short-term survival and more about how I could outlast this thing for as long as it took. If rescue was coming, it would have happened by now. I knew I had enough supplies to make it through another few weeks, but after that, I would need to grow food or find new ways to secure resources. I spent most of the morning reinforcing the house itself. I stripped wood from the shed and used it to add more braces across the windows. I built shutters that could be opened from inside to allow me to fire out if needed. I also reinforced the upstairs hallway with a makeshift barricade that could be pulled into place in seconds if someone breached the lower floor. By midday, I was in the yard, digging small fire pits along the fence line. These would serve as controlled burn areas where I could create smoke or fire as distractions. I marked them carefully, making sure they were downwind of the house, and covered them with scrap metal until I was ready to use them. When I wasn't working, I was planning. I sketched diagrams of the house and yard, marking choke points and sight lines. I made lists of what I still needed: more nails, more tarps, anything that could be used to shore up the defenses further. That night, sitting in the bunker, I realized that the routine I had built was the only thing keeping me grounded. Morning perimeter checks, scavenging trips when it was safe, trap maintenance, and reading at night. It gave me structure in a world that no longer had any, but I also knew it couldn't last forever. The 16th day started with the distant sound of helicopters, a low, rhythmic thrum that carried through the morning air long before I could see them. I climbed to the attic and watched the horizon. 2 black dots crossed the sky, heavy transport helicopters by the look of them, flying low and fast. They weren't circling or providing support for anyone on the ground. They were leaving. Not long after, the first explosion rolled across the hills. It was far away, but the concussion rattled the glass of the attic window. I stayed there for nearly an hour, watching as thin columns of smoke began to rise in different directions. Some small, like burning houses, others larger, like the fires you'd expect from collapsing fuel depots or entire neighborhoods going up. I had known for days that the collapse was accelerating, but seeing it confirmed in such stark detail turned that abstract dread into something sharper. Whatever remnants of authority had existed were pulling back, retreating, maybe abandoning whole areas. That thought made me revisit the traps around the property again. I took the better part of the day crawling along the perimeter and inspecting every line, every barricade. That was when I noticed things that didn't add up. A few of the tripwires were looser than I remembered setting them. One section of fencing was bent inward, as if someone had pressed against it hard. I crouched there for a long time, staring at the ground until I spotted the faint indentation of a boot print in the soft earth. It hadn't been the infected. Someone else had been close enough to test my defenses, and that realization made the hair stand up on my neck. The rest of the day was spent shoring up vulnerabilities. I added secondary lines of traps closer to the house and re-angled the barricades so I could cover them better from upstairs windows. I dug shallow crawl spaces under the shed leading to the bunker, camouflaging the openings with scrap plywood and leaves. If someone forced their way inside the house, I needed a way out. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of the dark living room with the rifle in my lap, replaying every possibility in my head. Whoever had tested the traps hadn't tried to breach the property. At least not yet, but the thought of being watched gnawed at me. The 17th day was the quietest yet. No helicopters, no explosions, no distant groans from the infected. The silence felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I spent most of the morning walking the interior of the house, rechecking every firearm, repositioning the machetes and katanas I had leaned against doorframes. I kept my pack half full of supplies and left it by the bunker entrance. If I had to leave in a hurry, I wanted everything ready. By afternoon, the isolation was getting to me. Every creak of the floorboards made me turn my head. I double-checked the basement doors 3 times in the span of an hour. At one point, I swore I heard faint footsteps outside, but when I went to the attic window, there was nothing. That night I barely ate. I just sat in the bunker and stared at the shelves, counting how much food I had left, trying to decide if I could stretch it another month without venturing into town. The 18th day began like the others. I was checking the trap lines in the yard when I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine in the distance. I froze, crouched low near the fence, straining to hear over the wind. Engines had become rare, fuel was running out, and the infected didn't drive. It was coming from the west, the faint sputter of a vehicle struggling for power. Minutes later, a battered SUV came into view, bouncing down the old county road, tires grinding through the gravel. I recognized it immediately. It was Ryan. I sprinted to the gate and waited as he pulled up, the engine coughing and dying as he turned the key off. He stepped out first, thinner than I remembered, his eyes darting over my shoulder like he expected trouble. His wife, Laura, followed, clutching their young son, Daniel, against her hip. The boy looked pale and exhausted, too tired to even cry. They were all filthy, clothes torn, hair matted with sweat. "We barely made it," my brother said. His voice was hoarse. "The quarantine zone was breached 2 nights ago. We just ran. We've been driving until the tank was empty." I stepped aside and let them through the gate, scanning the road as they hurried inside. Once the gate was secured behind them, I could breathe again, but only a little. Inside the house, I cleared space on the living room floor for them to sit while I checked the perimeter again. Nothing moved out there, but my mind was already racing with the implications. 3 more mouths to feed, 3 more bodies to protect. When I came back inside, my nephew was asleep on the blanket I had given them. His mother was trying to coax him to drink some water. My brother sat with his head in his hands, the weight of the last few days finally crashing down now that they were safe. For the moment. We didn't talk much that night. They were too exhausted, and I was too busy running through the logistics of what had just changed. My routines wouldn't work the same way anymore. Supplies would run out faster. Defenses would need to be stronger. The 19th day started with a new sound in the house. Movement. I woke to the soft creak of the floorboards as Laura tiptoed down the hallway, trying not to wake her son. Ryan was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of water in his hands, staring at nothing in particular. I could see the toll the last few days had taken on him. His eyes were sunken, and his knuckles were raw from gripping the steering wheel of that SUV for who knew how long. Breakfast was quiet. The boy barely touched the piece of dry bread his mother offered him, and I kept counting the number of jars and cans we opened. Every bit of food we ate felt like a debt coming due. I laid out the situation bluntly once everyone had eaten. We had enough food and water to make it maybe 3 weeks, but only if we rationed carefully. There would be no waste. Every meal would be measured, and no one would touch the stockpile in the bunker without my approval. My brother bristled at that. He said it wasn't right that one person controlled everything. I reminded him that he hadn't been the one holding the line here for the last 3 weeks, that he hadn't built the defenses or organized the supplies. This house had stayed safe because I had rules. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but he eventually nodded. We spent the rest of the day expanding the perimeter. Having extra hands made the work faster, but it also made it harder. My brother wasn't used to building barricades and laying traps. His wife tried to help, but she had to keep an eye on the boy, who was too young to understand why he couldn't run around the yard. I showed Ryan how to reset the tripwires and where to place the noise traps so they would draw the infected away from the house if triggered. He was impatient with the details, eager to just get it done, and I could feel my temper fraying. By mid-afternoon, we had reinforced the outer fence with more chain link and scrap wood, creating bottlenecks where I could take shots from upstairs. We also dug shallow trenches near the gates and lined them with sharp stakes made from broken broom handles. If someone rushed us, they'd pay for it. When the work was finally done, we sat in the shade of the shed, drinking warm water. Ryan asked what I planned to do about food once the stockpile ran out. I told him I hadn't decided yet. Hunting was dangerous with the infected so close, and scavenging in town was becoming harder. He suggested we start raiding nearby farms. I didn't like the idea. Farms meant open ground and no cover, but I didn't rule it out. That night, the house felt crowded in a way it never had before. Daniel cried in his sleep, and Laura whispered soft reassurances until he settled. Ryan tossed and turned on the floor, restless. I lay awake listening to the sounds of 3 other people breathing in the dark, wondering how I had ever thought solitude was the bigger danger. The 20th day began with another perimeter check. Having my brother along made the process slower, but I needed him to learn the routine. I showed him the spots where I had found evidence of someone tampering with the traps, and we reinforced those areas with additional lines and warning cans. As we worked, he asked about the infected. He had seen them up close in the quarantine zone and said their numbers were growing. He described how the soldiers had struggled to hold them back, how the fences eventually gave way under the sheer weight of bodies. I didn't tell him about the one I had caught in the snare and watched for hours. He didn't need to know how relentless they really were. After lunch, we turned our attention to the house itself. The windows upstairs were reinforced with more planks, and I built a heavier barricade for the back door using scrap metal and a door frame I had stripped from the garage. Ryan helped, but every step of the process felt like a negotiation. He wanted things done faster. I wanted them done right. By evening, we had a system for the nights. He would take the first watch, and I would take the second. Laura stayed in the bedroom with Daniel, who was growing quieter by the day. The 21st day was when the cracks began to show. We had set out early to expand the secondary trap lines, pushing them further into the tree line beyond the fence. The goal was to give us more warning if the infected, or anyone else, came near. but the work was grueling, and my brother's frustration was obvious. He snapped at me for insisting the lines be hidden perfectly, accusing me of wasting time on details when we should be thinking about food. I snapped back, reminding him that one mistake could get us all killed. The argument didn't last long, but the tension lingered. Laura avoided eye contact with me for the rest of the day, and even the boys seemed to sense the shift. That night, when it was my turn for watch, I sat near the front window with the rifle and thought about how much harder everything had become. I didn't regret letting them in, but I couldn't ignore the reality. Every extra person made us weaker in some ways. We needed more food, more water, and stronger defenses, and we needed them soon. On the 22nd day, I decided we had no choice but to push farther out. My brother and his wife both looked uneasy when I told them we would be scavenging farms and homes beyond the town limits, but there was no alternative. The food we had was already running low, and rationing more tightly wasn't going to make it magically last longer. We needed livestock, if there were any left, and canned goods from houses that might have been skipped over during the evacuations. We left at first light. Ryan carried a rifle, though he wasn't comfortable with it, and Laura carried one of the pistols I had pre-positioned throughout the house. I made sure she knew how to use it, even though she clearly wished she didn't have to. We followed back roads to avoid open ground, the SUV creeping forward at barely above walking speed, engine kept as quiet as we could manage. The first farm we stopped at was little more than a husk. The house had been stripped bare, every window broken, every cabinet empty. The barn was wide open, and the smell told me it had been empty for a long time. We found a few half-ruined bags of feed, and an old generator that was missing its fuel line, but no livestock. It was the same story at the next farm, and the one after that. By midday, we were deeper into the countryside than I had wanted, but turning back empty-handed wasn't an option. When we finally spotted a small farmhouse tucked behind a stand of trees, it felt like our last chance. The building was intact, shutters still bolted, but the front door showed signs of having been forced open recently. I motioned for Ryan and Laura to stay low as we approached. The yard was silent, no movement except for the rustling of leaves. We entered through the side door, weapons raised, and swept each room. The house was empty, but someone had been there recently. We found a small pile of trash in the kitchen, fresh enough that it hadn't started to rot. I knew we should leave, but a quick search of the pantry turned up canned vegetables, bags of rice, and a few bottles of water. I packed as much as I could into my bag, my brother grabbing what I couldn't carry. That was when the sound came from the back of the house. It was the unmistakable creak of a floorboard under weight. I raised my rifle and motioned for Ryan to cover me as I moved toward the sound. Two figures stepped into the hallway, both holding shotguns. They weren't infected, but the way they looked at us made it clear they weren't about to invite us to stay. The taller of the two, a man with a patchy beard and clothes that looked as if they hadn't been washed in weeks, barked at us to drop our weapons. I didn't move. My brother froze, eyes darting toward me for direction. "This is our house now," the man said, voice rough from lack of use. "Put it down, and maybe you can walk away." I didn't trust him, and I didn't want a firefight inside a building we couldn't defend. Slowly, I motioned for my brother and his wife to back up. The man stepped forward, but I could see how his shotgun trembled in his hands. "We're leaving," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "We'll take what we already grabbed, and that's it." The man's partner, a younger guy who couldn't have been older than 20, muttered something about us lying and raised his gun higher. That was all it took. I fired a single round into the wall just above their heads. The crack was deafening inside the small house, plaster raining down as the two men ducked instinctively. I grabbed Ryan by the shoulder and pulled him toward the door. We sprinted for the SUV as the two men shouted after us. The noise had been loud enough to carry for miles. As we reached the car, I heard the first groans from the trees. We barely made it out. A small pack of infected burst from the brush on the far side of the property, just as we slammed the SUV doors shut. I counted at least 7 of them, all sprinting toward the noise they had heard. My brother floored the accelerator, tires spinning in the dirt as we tore down the narrow driveway. I watched in the side mirror as the infected swarmed the house. They didn't hesitate, didn't slow down, just crashed through the open door in a single mass. That was the first time I realized how dangerous they were in groups. 1 or 2 infected could be avoided or picked off if you were careful, but 7 moving together could overrun you before you even had a chance to fire a shot. Back at the house, I gathered Ryan and Laura in the living room and laid it out for them. We had enough food now to last maybe a couple more weeks, but the real threat was the infected. They were starting to move in packs, drawn by noise, and our defenses might not hold if too many hit us at once. I could see the fear in their eyes, but there was no time to soften the truth. I told them they had to learn how to fight. Ryan nodded reluctantly. Laura hesitated, but she knew there was no alternative. I started them with the basics: how to handle the weapons safely, how to load and clear jams, how to keep their movements controlled instead of panicked. My patience was thin. Every mistake they made felt like it was putting all of us at risk. But by the end of the 23rd day, they could at least hit a target reliably at close range. The next morning, I took them outside to the trap lines and showed them how each one worked, how the noise traps would distract the infected, how the deadfalls were set to drop heavy logs into the choke points. They didn't have my eye for details, but they were learning. That afternoon, we reinforced the secondary perimeter again, adding more barricades near the far fence line and resetting the snare traps I had used to catch the infected earlier. I showed them how to stay quiet while working, how to use hand signals if we needed to communicate. When the sun dipped, we retreated to the house, all 3 of us exhausted, but for the first time, I felt like we might have a chance of holding the property if things got bad. That night, as I sat on watch near the upstairs window, I saw movement in the trees beyond the fence. A group of at least 4 infected wandered aimlessly, their heads turning sharply at every sound the wind carried. I stayed perfectly still, keeping the barrel of the rifle pointed just past the edge of the fence line. They didn't seem to know I was there, but their movements were unnerving. One would break off from the group and stumble toward a rustling in the brush, then rejoin the others when it found nothing. They weren't coordinated, but they weren't completely without awareness either. It felt like watching predators that had not yet decided to close in on prey. I didn't fire. The noise would only draw more of them, and I couldn't risk exposing our exact location unless it was absolutely necessary. Eventually, after what felt like hours, they drifted deeper into the woods and disappeared. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my eyes scanning the fence line until the first light of dawn. The 25th day began with repairs. The infected hadn't breached the perimeter overnight, but the weight of the wind and the weeks of stress were starting to show. Sections of the outer fence sagged inward, and a few of the stakes we had driven into the ground were loose. Ryan and I spent most of the morning retightening wire and shoring up weak points with whatever scrap wood we could salvage. While we worked, I noticed my nephew watching us from the back porch. He wasn't speaking much these days, and his mother hovered near him constantly. I wondered what effect all this was having on him, growing up in a world where fear had become the background noise of every day. By the time we finished the perimeter check, it was nearly noon. We found evidence that the infected had passed close by during the night. Broken branches, disturbed leaves near the trap lines, but they hadn't triggered anything. I reinforced the deadfalls anyway, adjusting the trigger points so that even lighter pressure would set them off. That afternoon was spent repairing one of the noise traps that had collapsed. I was halfway through hammering a post back into place when I heard a shout from the house. My brother was at the upstairs window, waving me inside. I ran up the stairs, heart thudding, and he pointed out toward the tree line. 2 figures were crouched near the edge of the woods, partially obscured by brush. They weren't infected. Their movements were too deliberate. One of them held binoculars, scanning the house and yard. We watched for several minutes as they observed from a distance. They weren't making any attempt to approach, but their intent was obvious. They were scouting us. I didn't want to fire blindly and risk starting a gunfight, but I also couldn't let them think they could get close without consequence. I leaned the rifle out the window and squeezed off a single shot into the ground about 10 feet from where they were crouched. The crack split the air, and both figures dropped flat, scrambling backward before melting into the trees. I waited another half hour to make sure they weren't circling back, but they never reappeared. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. It wasn't the infected I was worried about anymore. The sight of those two figures watching the house had confirmed what I had feared since the day my traps were tampered with. Other survivors knew this property was fortified and stocked. We couldn't afford to stay reactive forever. The 26th day was a long blur of work. I pushed Ryan and Laura hard, forcing them to help with repairs even when they were clearly tired. Every weak spot we left unaddressed was an invitation. We added more barricades near the front gate and reinforced the back door with an additional crossbar. I also started planning escape routes, in case the house itself became untenable. I walked them through the bunker access points and showed them how to use the crawl space under the shed. Ryan was skeptical about abandoning the house if things went bad, but I told him the reality. Walls could be breached, plans failed, we needed backup options. By afternoon, the strain was showing. Ryan snapped at me when I criticized the way he set a trap, and I snapped back. Laura tried to smooth things over, but I could see the frustration in her eyes too. They weren't used to living under constant pressure, and I didn't know how to make them understand that the smallest mistake could cost all our lives. That night, we rotated watches again. When it was my turn, I climbed to the attic with the rifle and scanned the tree line. For a while, everything was still. Then I saw them. Not the same two from the previous day, but at least 3 figures moving slowly through the woods, careful not to make noise. They didn't come close this time. They stayed just far enough away to keep me guessing, but I knew what they were doing, testing the perimeter, learning how we responded. I kept the rifle aimed in their direction, but I didn't fire. Instead, I waited, memorizing their positions and the way they moved. After 20 minutes, they disappeared into the trees, leaving me staring into the darkness long after they were gone. The 27th day began with another near breach, this time from the infected. One of the noise traps went off just after dawn, and by the time I reached the outer fence, 3 infected were already clawing at the wire. I fired from a distance, picking them off one by one, but the sound was enough to bring 2 more from the woods. We managed to put them down before they reached the barricades, but the fence was damaged badly enough that we had to repair it immediately. As we worked, I felt the weight of the last few days settling in. The infected were becoming bolder, and the presence of other survivors nearby meant we couldn't count on isolation to keep us safe. The property was holding, but just barely. I gathered everyone in the living room that evening and told them the truth. We couldn't rely on reacting to each crisis as it came. We needed a strategy to hold this place long-term, or we'd be overrun eventually. They didn't argue, but the unease on their faces said enough. Laura held Daniel close as he slept against her shoulder, as though she was already imagining what might happen if we failed. Ryan asked what I meant by a strategy, and I admitted I didn't know yet. All I knew was that our walls and traps wouldn't last forever. The 28th day passed without any incident, which only made me more uneasy. The infected hadn't been quiet in weeks, and now the woods were silent. Ryan helped me recheck the perimeter, while Laura kept Daniel busy inside. We tightened loose barricades and reset the traps, but the feeling of being watched never left. That night, I stayed awake for my watch long past the point I should have handed it over. The darkness outside felt heavier than usual, as though the forest beyond the fence was holding its breath. I saw them just after midnight, shadows moving along the far edge of the tree line. At first I thought it was survivors again, testing our defenses, but the shapes weren't deliberate enough. Their movements were uneven, heads jerking to every sound. There were at least a dozen of them. The infected. I slipped from the attic down to the living room and shook my brother awake. His eyes widened as I whispered what I had seen. We roused Laura and gathered the weapons. There wasn't time to argue. The first trap triggered with a loud crash as one of the infected tripped a snare. The noise drew the rest of them forward, and soon the entire yard was alive with the sound of bodies pushing against the fence and clawing at the barricades. We moved from window to window, firing carefully to conserve ammunition. My brother's hands shook as he worked the rifle bolt, but he didn't stop. Laura stayed in the hallway with the pistol, guarding the room where their son was hiding. The infected came hard and fast. They crashed through the outer fence within minutes, forcing us back to the second line of defenses. Deadfalls triggered with loud thuds as logs smashed into bodies, but the momentum didn't slow. One of them managed to breach the back door before I dropped it with a shot to the head. Another came through a broken window and had to be dragged back out as it clawed at the floor. Ryan nearly got his arm taken off trying to shut the door behind it. The fight lasted for what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than 30 minutes. When the last of the infected lay still, the yard was a ruin of broken barricades, torn wire, and shattered windows. We barely had time to breathe before the second threat arrived. I spotted them first, figures darting between the trees just beyond the fence. They weren't infected. These were survivors, the same ones who had been watching us for days. They must have been waiting for the infected to soften us up. I cursed under my breath and called Ryan to the front door. We barely had time to reload before they were at the fence, testing it in different places, looking for weaknesses. The first shot I fired dropped a man trying to climb the fence near the driveway. Ryan picked off another as he tried to sprint for the back door. There were at least 5 of them, maybe more, and they weren't backing down. One of them slipped past us entirely. We heard the door slam open at the rear of the house, followed by a sharp scream from the hallway where Laura had been guarding their son. I ran as fast as I could, but by the time I reached the hallway, it was already over. She stood there shaking, the pistol still raised, the intruder lying face down on the floor at her feet. He had been armed with a knife and was less than 3 feet from where Daniel had been hiding. She didn't say a word as I took the weapon from her trembling hands. By the time we cleared the house, the remaining attackers were gone. 3 lay dead near the fence line, and the others had vanished into the woods, leaving behind only the echo of their footsteps. We stood in the yard under the pale light of the moon, the smell of gunpowder and blood hanging in the air, and I realized how close we had come to losing everything. The rest of the night was spent dragging bodies away from the fence and repairing what we could. No one spoke much. Laura refused to let go of her son as she sat in the living room, staring blankly at the floor. Ryan helped me reset the traps, his face drawn and pale. By dawn, the property was secure again, but it was an illusion. We all knew it. The fight had exposed every weakness in our defenses. The outer fence had collapsed under pressure, and the second line would never hold if another large pack came. We had burned through far too much ammunition, and our food supply was nearly gone again. I stood in the yard as the sun rose, the light falling on the broken barricades and the torn earth, and I understood the truth. This house wasn't a fortress. It was a trap waiting to fail, and we couldn't survive here forever. I gathered everyone together and told them what I already knew. We would have to adapt. The bunker and the yard, all the traps and walls I had built, weren't enough anymore. We needed to work together, plan beyond this property, and find a way to rebuild something larger and stronger than a single fortified house. Ryan didn't argue. Laura just held Daniel closer and nodded. For the first time since this had started, I allowed myself to think about a future that wasn't just surviving from one day to the next, but I also knew that future wouldn't come easy, and the world outside wasn't going to wait for us to be ready. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.